Bismillah, we begin the recitation with calm hearts and clear intention. Every letter, every sound, read the Qur'an the way it was sent down. The way it was sent down.
What is Makharij and Sifat? The word Makharij is plural of Makhraj, and literally it means an exit point. And in terms of Tajweed, it refers to the articulation point from which a sound is released. As for the word Sifat, it is the plural of the word Sifa, which means a characteristic. So, Sifatul Huruf is the characteristics of letters. Now let's start with the first and the more basic concept, which is Makharij al-Huruf. In order to get to know where letters come from exactly, we should first learn this chart to give us an idea about the organs that produce the sounds. The first thing that we notice is that there are 5 major areas in this chart, and they are the oral cavity, which is all this dark blue and green area. So all of this is the oral cavity. We call it in Arabic al-jawf. The second area is the throat, which is this dark blue area, and we call it in Arabic al-halq. So al-halq is part of al-jawf, the oral cavity. Third, the tongue, which is al-lisan. Next we have the lips. These are ash-shafatayn. And finally, we have the nasal cavity, which is al-khayshum. Each of these 5 areas contains several points of articulation. Each of these articulation points is called makhraj. There are in total 17 makhraj, or 17 points of articulation. These 17 points produce all the sounds in Arabic. You can also call it 17 devices producing the sounds. Each one of these devices has a name and produce a number of sounds. How could linguists determine the place from which a sound is produced? Well, they would use one of 2 methods, and through these methods, they could determine where and how a letter is produced. The first method is saying the letter with shadda on it. So, the letter qaf, for example, we would then say qa, qa. And for the letter ba, we say ba, ba. Another way is using hamza with fatha on it, followed by the consonant you want to test. So then it would sound like this. Aqqa, aqqa, as, as. This could also be a good method for you to compare your point of articulation for a particular letter to make sure that you're pronouncing the letter from the correct makhraj. Alright, now that we know the basics of studying makharij, let us start with the first and the easiest area of articulation, which is the oral cavity. This area is the makhraj of the 3 long vowels, which are alif. The second is waw preceded by dhamma, and that is al-waw al-maddiyya. And last is ya preceded by kasra, and it is also called al-ya al-maddiyya. Now, naturally, we're adding the word maddiyya after waw and ya because there is another version of these 2 letters in which they are not functioning as a long vowel, and their pronunciation will be slightly different from their pronunciation as long vowels. But now we're only focusing on the 3 med letters. These 3 med letters do not have a specific point that they finish at, like other consonants do. Instead, these vowels finish with the stopping of the sound. You're basically pushing air through your throat, but that is not the only thing you're doing. The shape of your lips and other organs in your mouth determines what sound this flow of air produces. To understand more what I mean, let us start by the first one, which is alif. Alif is always preceded by a letter with fatha, so it is always used as a med letter. When pronouncing alif in Arabic, the only thing you should be paying attention to is the opening of your mouth. It should not be too wide open, and at the same time, it shouldn't be too closed either. It should be somewhere in between, an average opening. Like when we say, ماء قال على. So the opening of the mouth should be an average one to produce the alif properly. As for the waw, it is the same process, except that the lips will be in an O shape, again in an average position. This means that the O shape of your lips should not be too open or too wide, and at the same time it shouldn't be too tight either. قالوا يلوون ثلاثة قروء. If the shape of the mouth is too open, a hint of the sound of alif will be mixed with the waw, and that is not correct, of course. The final sound is the ya. This sound is very similar to the way the alif is produced, but the only difference is that the tongue, the middle of the tongue, is raised when it comes to pronouncing the E sound, or al-ya'ul maddiyya. So we say E, si, at, fi. So these were the three letters that are produced from the mouth cavity, or from al-jawf. A, U, E. The area of the throat, or al-halq, contains 3 points of articulation. They are the farthest part of the throat, the middle part, and the closest part of the throat. And as it happens, each of these 3 articulation points produces 2 sounds. The farthest part of the throat produces ha and hamza. The middle part produces ha and ayn, and the closest part produces kha and ghayn. And in this lesson, we'll focus on the farthest part of the throat and the sounds produced in that area. The sounds produced by ha and hamza are ha and a. Both of ha and a are produced by controlling your vocal folds. We also call them vocal cords, which are located at the furthest part of your throat. Let's start with ha. Ha is simply letting air pass through your vocal cords. The opening of your vocal cords has to be slightly closed so that this friction can take place and the sound can be produced. That little friction sound caused by air passing through is that ha sound. Ha, ha. Huda, ihdina, fabihudahu muqtadih. So air passing through the slightly closed vocal cords produces the proper ha sound. As for the hamza, which produces the sound of a, it is also produced by controlling your vocal cords, but this time you'll be doing the opposite of what we were doing with the ha sound. It is essentially stopping air from passing, and we do that by closing the vocal cords. Ya'ti, أرى شيء. So for the ha, you let air pass through the slightly open vocal cords, and for the hamza, you completely close down the vocal cords, which causes the air to stop, and this is exactly the sound of hamza. Now this was the technique of producing these two sounds. And while they are easy enough to produce, when using them in context while reciting the Qur'an, there are many common mistakes that you as a learner should learn to avoid. Let's start with the common mistakes that may happen when producing the ha sound. We learned a while ago that with ha, your vocal cords should be slightly closed, still open but slightly closed, to cause the friction to happen and to produce the sound. The first and most common mistake with ha is when opening your vocal cords too widely. As a result, you will find yourself having to push more air out to force the friction to happen through the wider open. And this in turn forces you to empty your lung of air so that you can produce the sound. And eventually the sound of ha will still be very weak. This especially happens when ha is used in the middle of the word when it has sukun on it. So for example, in Surah Al-Fatiha, the word ihdina, in case of opening the vocal cords too widely, it can sound like this. Ihdina. So not applying the proper technique when pronouncing the letter ha will force you to exaggerate how you produce the sound, and the sound will still sound quite weak. Another mistake is when ha comes at the end of a word that you are stopping at, especially after a mad letter. The common mistake would then be not pronouncing the ha clearly enough, because of not pushing enough air out to make the sound audible enough. كلما أضاء لهم مشوا فيه. Now this sounds more like fi without the ha. This is definitely a mistake that should be avoided. And you do that by making sure that you're pushing enough air out so that the ha will be audible at the end of the word, especially when it has sukun at the end of the word, like in this situation. And it should sound like this. كلما أضاء لهم مشوا فيه. Now moving on to the common mistakes of the hamza. The first common mistake occurs when the vocal cords are not fully closed, which then makes the hamza almost not audible at all, especially when it is in the middle of the word. Like when we say, يا أيها الذين آمنوا. Instead, you should always make sure that you're making that cutting sound of hamza produced by closing down the vocal cords completely. And say, يا أيها الذين آمنوا. The second mistake is letting a small gush of air escape through the vocal cords, and this causes the hamza to have some sort of a qalqala or a slight ha sound following the hamza directly. Like so. يأتي يأتي السماء السماء. And this mistake is usually made by learners who want to make sure to pronounce the hamza fully. So they kind of exaggerate the sound, and then the mistake is made. Instead, hamza should be a pure closure of vocal cords, stopping air momentarily without exaggeration or inattention. يأتي يأتي السماء. And what can particularly help when hamza comes at the end of the word, like in the word as-sama', is applying proper nabr. So, in a nutshell, the ha and hamza are produced at the vocal cords, which is found at the farthest area of the throat. With ha, you slightly close your vocal cords, and with hamza, you completely close them down. The most important piece of advice to get these sounds right every time is not to exaggerate producing these sounds while giving them enough attention, since while they might be easy to produce, they are also easy to overlook. As we said, ha and ayn come from the middle part of the throat, but to be more specific, from an organ called the epiglottis, which is that small flat part at the back of the tongue that closes when you swallow to prevent food from entering the tube that goes into your lungs. So controlling that area is the most important thing to learn to produce ha and ayn successfully. We'll start with the sound of ayn. Ayn is produced when the epiglottis is pushed all the way back to the wall of the throat while leaving a small opening at which the sound is generated. Pay attention, the sound is not generated by pushing air out, but by vibrating your vocal cords. Ah, ah. The sound of ayn is a semi-continuous sound, which means that it can be extended or made longer. And while that is not the point when reciting the Qur'an, it is an indication that you're pronouncing the ayn correctly. Ta'tadu, ta'tadu, wa'budu, wa'budu. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. Moving on to the ha, which is the other sound that is generated from the same articulation point, using the same organ, the epiglottis. This time your epiglottis will not go far or push against the wall of your throat like we did with ayn. So it will not go as far as the ayn. Another difference is that with ha, you'll be pushing air out. The friction of that air passing through the small opening generates the ha sound. Ah, ah, ahdarat, ahdarat, محفوظ محفوظ. So, for the ayn, you push the epiglottis almost against the wall of your throat to force the sound from that area. While the ha, you push the epiglottis back, not as much, and you will push air out to cause the friction to happen and generate the sound. So these are the two sounds generated from the middle part of the throat, using the epiglottis. And as a matter of fact, how much you can control your epiglottis will determine how well you can produce these two sounds. Here are two tricks you can try to help yourself have more control over your epiglottis. The first trick is to start by applying a gargling position, because when your neck is in this position, it is easier to practice your ayn and control your epiglottis. After that, you start with an ah sound, a full mouth alif, and you keep pushing up that ah sound until you feel it is not a vowel anymore, and you start hearing the proper ayn. Ah. The other trick to try to practice both ayn and ha is by lying on your back and practicing both of these sounds. This position helps a lot with controlling your epiglottis more easily when you're standing upright. And as a rule of thumb, if you don't know either of these two sounds, it is usually easier to start at the ha and then push back to achieve the ayn sound, because the ha for most people is easier as a starting point, since it is lighter to pronounce than ayn. Alright, Now that we know the basics of how these sounds are performed, let us discuss the most common mistakes related to these two sounds. As for the ayn, the first mistake is pushing your epiglottis too far back, turning the ayn into a hard, cut letter with no continuation whatsoever. The result is that the ayn, especially when used in the middle of the sentence, would essentially split the word into two, and that is not a good technique, of course. Like na'budu, na'budu. Instead, the sound of ayn should be an easy one on the ear, and most importantly, to know if you're making the right sound, try to extend it a bit. Ah. If you can, then you are on the right track. If you are stopping and can't extend, that means your ayn is too hard and probably splitting words. The second mistake is leaving too big an opening between the wall of your throat and the epiglottis, producing what we call in Tajweed a floating ayn, which sounds like this. Na'budu, na'budu. So this ayn is closer to an alif rather than an actual ayn, and this should also be avoided. These two mistakes are mostly made by beginners, but with more exercise, you can get there insha'Allah. Finally, adding qalqala to ayn with sukoon, and it sounds like this. Na'budu, na'budu. Innahu ya'lamul jahr. The ayn is not a qalqala letter. If it has sukoon, then it is fully sakin, a pure consonant. Innahu ya'lamul jahr. Next, the first common mistake of ha is pronouncing it as ha. This happens when you don't push your epiglottis at all, which could probably happen if you're trying the ha sound for the first time, or when you don't have control over your epiglottis yet. Ahwa, ahwa. So it is important to hear the difference, and more important, not to mix them up, because this is a mistake that can potentially change the meaning of the word. فَجَعَلَهُ غُثَاءً أَحْوَى. The other mistake is assimilating the ha and ayn sound when they follow one another. This mistake can easily happen because both of these sounds come from the exact same spot. A mistake sounds like this. فَاصْفَحْ عَنْهُمْ, فَاصْفَحْ عَنْهُمْ. So when they follow one another, make sure you produce the first one clearly before moving to the next one. فَاصْفَحْ عَنْهُمْ, فَاصْفَحْ عَنْهُمْ. Finally, while ha and ayn might be among the most difficult sounds in Arabic, the more you practice and the more you read the Qur'an, the easier they get, insha'Allah. Thanks for watching. And don't forget to check out my latest book, which goes perfectly with this free course. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.
Bismillah, we begin the recitation with calm hearts and clear intention. Every letter, every sound, read the Qur'an the way it was sent down. The way it was sent down.
Production.